Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the early modern papacy. We left off last time with the death of Pope Paul IV. So we pick up where we left off there and move into the reign of Pope Pius IV, Pope 224. Pope Paul IV died on the 18th of August, 1559, at the age of 83. This was followed by widespread rioting, as we covered in the previous session, owing to pervasive rage over his authoritarian regime. 3 of the cardinals in the conclave to elect his successor were his nephews, Carlo, Diomede, and Alfonso Carafa, of the House of Carafa. They were corrupt, not only in terms of embezzlement and nepotism, which were characteristic problems of feudalism, but they had exercised their criminality with such brutality that that's contributed to the explosion of urban violence when Uncle Pope Paul died. 3,700 infantry troops, along with 300 cavalry, were required to restore order in the city of Rome before the conclave commenced. It turned out to be the longest conclave of the 16th century, lasting 4 months, from September 5th through December 25th, 1559. 55 cardinals were eligible to participate, of whom 47 actually did travel to Rome for the occasion. Of those 47 present for voting, 37 were ethnically Italian, 7 were French, 2 Spanish, and 1 German. Of the 8 absent cardinals, 5 were ethnically French, and we'll see shortly what was going on in France, is why so many of them did not go, as France was plummeting into the abyss, which it'll take a while to explain. But to stick with the conclave, 1 Spanish, 1 Portuguese, and 1 Italian also did not attend. Ethnic hatreds were on full display during the conclave, as with so many others, as ethnic hatred only, and always serves Satan. Layered on top of those perennial emotions were political and economic considerations, as some of the cardinals, regardless of their own ethnic origin, some actually we know did, owe their position and their allegiance to a sponsor of a different ethnicity or national origin. Therefore, the 1559 conclave was divided into 3 factions. The Spanish faction consisted of 17 cardinals, led by 2 Italians, owing to the Spanish claims on Italy, parts of Italy which we've already covered. One of the Italians who was aligned with the Spanish, was Guido Ascanio Sforza, Sforza. He was a cardinal. His titular church was Santa Maria in the Via Lata. He was also administrator of the Diocese of Parma, and he received gratuities from the Portuguese, who at this point were allied with the Spanish. That was not always the case, but at this point they were. The other Italian cardinal leading the Spanish faction was Cristoforo Madruso. he was bishop. He was actually Bishop of Trent. Therefore, if the Council of Trent would ever resume, which of course it will resume, but at the time it was suspended since 1552. Remember, then he would be the hosting bishop of the Council of Trent. So these guys, serving the interest of the Spanish and Portuguese, their only objective was to avoid at all cost having a French-aligned pope. Not just to avoid having an ethnically French pope, but to avoid having one who might be Italian, but aligned with the French, so that, because at this point the Spanish and the French hated each other. Well, the French had their own faction, that second faction in the conclave, which consisted of 16 cardinals, led by one Italian and one Frenchman. The Frenchman was Charles de Guise. That's D-E, de is the particle indicating nobility, and G-U-I-S-E. We've met this family already, and we will several more times. He was the Archbishop of Reims in France. He was the brother of Marie de Guise, and therefore uncle to her daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. His life will occupy our attention after the conclave, as well as that of his brother and his sister. In September of 1559, the conclave opened before he arrived in Rome. Festering resentment over this nearly derailed the third period of the Council of Trent, as we shall see. In other words, he nearly derailed the third period of the Council of Trent because he was so mad over this that the conclave started without him. This is a person with a monumental ego. The Italian agent for the French was Cardinal Ippolito d'Este. That's D''E''S''T''E. He was ethnically Italian, but he was born a younger son into the family of the Dukes of Ferrara in Tuscany. Ippolito was aligned politically and financially with French interest, owing to income he received from 4 benefices in France. So, you see, that's part of the feudalism problem. The Italian faction, the third faction in the conclave, the Italian faction, in this case used for the proto-nationalists who preferred Italy and the Church to be governed by Italians. And that faction was comprised of 14 cardinals. They were led by 2 of their number, 2 Italian cardinals. One of them was one of the 3 nephews of the late Pope in the conclave, Carlo Carafa. The other leader of the Italian faction was Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. Okay. So the conclave opened on these terms on the 5th of September, 1559, with only 40 cardinals present. Eventually 47 would participate, but it opened with only 40. So right off but they're not following the conclave, protocol as they were supposed to, but no. So the French had not yet arrived. So the Spanish faction attempted to press for the election of one of their own by acclamation, but he failed to get sufficient votes. And the French never forgot this when they finally did come, and Cardinal de Guise was one of them. They never forgot this. So when we see how later Cardinal Moroni is going to have so much trouble at the third period of Trent with Cardinal de Guise, it's because of this, that wounded pride. Which, of course, pride is it's the first of the 7 for a reason, because Satan makes such use of it, because we're stupid enough to let him. 3 days later, on September 8th, the cardinals signed a document in which they all pledged that whomever among their number was elected pope would resume the Council of Trent and the work of the Council of Reform. By the end of the month, 7 more cardinals arrived in Rome. On September 25th, the Spanish ambassador also arrived to intervene, even though he was a layman, Don Francisco de Vargas. Another layman, an Italian layman, Duke Cosimo de' Medici, exercised parallel outside influence on behalf of the Italian faction. So as we've seen with many of these families, they keep reusing names. So that it just makes it confusing to follow who is who. This Cosimo de' Medici was a great-grandson of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo's grandfather was named Cosimo, and now this guy, Lorenzo's great-grandson, is also named Cosimo. And he was, at this point, Duke of Florence. He exercised parallel outside influence on behalf of the Italians. Now the Germans, when I was going through the ethnic list, you may have been struck that there was only one German cardinal. Well, keep in mind what happened, that the international anti-Catholic protest movement had successfully removed half of Germany from the church. So that's all those dioceses, gone. And previous for centuries, they would have had Catholic bishops and would have had more cardinals. So the Holy Roman Emperor was a Habsburg, Ferdinand von Habsburg, Ferdinand I. He was the brother of the now abdicated Emperor Charles V. He aligned at this point in 1559 with the Italian faction because he knew there was only one German cardinal, so there was no way he was going to get a German pope. So he aligned with the Italians because at this point he despised the Italians less than he despised the French and the Spanish. The emperor's military interests in Italy were defended at this time by a condottiero, a professional mercenary general named Gian Giacomo de' Medici. He was of the Milanese branch of the Medici family, and therefore was a relative of Duke Cosimo of Florence. So he's not in the direct line. He's not a descendant of Lorenzo. But so you have to go back. Let's see. Lorenzo's grandfather, the previous Cosimo, he had siblings. And the Milanese branch is descended from one of his siblings. So it's far back. So it's the current de' Medici in Florence, Duke Cosimo, his great-grandfather was Lorenzo. So the common branch, the commonality between the Florence branch and the Milanese branch goes back to Lorenzo's grandfather. So, that's way, way back. But they are related. And we're aware of that. I mean, certainly the Italian families were very aware of who's related to who. One of the cardinals in the conclave died, Cardinal Girolamo Campodeferro. He died on December 1st. One of the French cardinals, Jean de Belay, left the conclave on December 13th. Another cardinal, Cardinal Giovanni Saraceni, left the conclave on December 19th, either for reasons of poor health or just out of disgust because it was just going on too long. Having then lost the numbers to have any hope of securing the election of an ethnically French pope, the French faction then allied with the Italian faction, as at this point they detested the Italians less than they detested the Spanish at this point. Coincidentally, the mother of the reigning French king, Francois II, was an Italian whom we've already met, Catherine de' Medici. She was a relative of Duke Cosimo, the Medici of Florence. So she was descended related to the Florentine branch of the family, and therefore was related to the German-employed Italian condottiero Gian Giacomo de' Medici. So why do I keep referring to the Medicis? Because another member of the Medici family happened to be one of the cardinals in the conclave, who was aligned with the Italian faction. Not only was he ethnically Italian, he was also aligned with their political faction. And this was Cardinal Angelo de' Medici. His full name was Giovanni Angelo de' Medici, but there was a previous Medici pope who was Leo X, who was Giovanni de' Medici. So just to avoid the confusion, we'll call him by his a shorter version of his name, Cardinal Angelo de' Medici. He was elected pope by the French and the Italian factions. He accepted election on Christmas Day, 1559. As with the Renaissance problem, and certainly in keeping with the example of his predecessors, the two Medicis had been pope, Leo X and Clement VII. So this guy, who took the name Pius IV, had at least three illegitimate children. He spent the reign of the previous pope, Paul IV, outside of Rome as Archbishop of Ragusa, which is on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea. And he was committed to resuming the Council of Trent, which had been suspended since 1552, owing to the Eighth Habsburg-Valois War, which we already covered. He served for 6 years as the 224th pope under the papal name Pius IV. Born in Milan, northern Italy, on March 31st, 1499, Angelo de' Medici was the second of 11 children born to Bernardino de' Medici and his wife Celia of the House of Serbelloni. He was the younger brother of the condottiero Gian Giacomo de' Medici, and he was the maternal uncle of Saint Charles Borromeo, whom we will meet in due course. Angelo studied philosophy in Pavia, then studied law in Bologna. He earned doctorates in both canon law and civil law. He graduated. Well, they wouldn't. But their version of graduation. He was awarded the doctorates on May 11th, 1525. He then moved to Rome, where his family connections secured him the patronage of Pope Paul III. This led to terms as governor of several towns in the Papal State, ordination as Archbishop of Ragusa, assignment as vice-legate to Bologna, and appointment to the College of Cardinals in April of 1549, after which there were diplomatic missions to Germany and Hungary. So as Pope, as with his two Medici relatives who had been Pope, Leo X and Clement VII, he brought a wide range of experience and contacts. He was an aristocrat. He was multilingual, highly cultured. He knew everybody. He had traveled. And beyond that, he had another, beyond his obvious, his education and his experience, he also had something very rare, even rarer than that. He had the gift of setting aside his own ego as a leader and surrounded himself with men of real talent and ability, even those that may have had more talent and ability than him. But he had that gift that that didn't bother him. He was secure enough. He had his own talents. He was multilingual. He had his own talents too, but he did not mind if he had guys around him who were smarter than him, and he was willing to share authority with them if it got him what he wanted, if it achieved the objective he wanted. And that's going to help the church. And so this is the guy who's going to finally bring the Council of Trent to conclusion. Among those that he recruited and gathered to Rome were Saint Philip Neri, Saint Charles Borromeo, and Cardinal Giovanni Morone. That's Morone. And as Pope, Pius IV, Angelo de' Medici needed every available advantage because the Catholic world was just going to pieces. He inherited the wreckage of the international anti-Catholic protest movement. As we have covered previously, half of Germany, half of Switzerland, all of Holland, all of Norway, all of Sweden, and all of England were taken over by the protesters. And in the sense that those places all replaced. I mean, the Catholic Church was replaced by variations of the protest ecclesiologies, either the Lutheran or the Anglican or the Calvinist or the Zwingli, but which and while they differed among themselves on matters of theology, they were all united in their core, their initiating nucleus of anti-Catholicism. Owing to an event that took place 1 month before the death of the previous Pope, Paul IV, the new Pope, Pius IV, faced the prospect that France, Scotland, and Ireland might go the same way outside of the Church. This precipitating event, was the death of the French king, Henri II, husband of the new Pope's cousin, Catherine de' Medici. The king, Henri II, died on July 10th, 1559. The cause of death was septicemia, from an infected eye wound, which he received in a joust on the 30th of June, 1559. The joust was part of a tournament to celebrate the end of the 8th Habsburg-Valois War, which we covered previously. And this idiot, part of the show, the king, he's going to, dress up in armor and he's going to joust. And it was for show. I mean, the other guy was not actually trying to hurt him. But the lances, they were wood, so they would break. And it was just a splinter. He had the visor, the headgear on, and a splinter broke, and it just, it was one of those things, even though it went through the eye slit. And of course, they had no antibiotics, they didn't, so it got infected. And he died about a week later. So the king is dead. He had a number of children with his wife, Catherine de' Medici. The eldest surviving son was 15 years old, so he became King Francis II. Francois was already married to a girl we've already met. He was married to the 16-year-old Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's mother, you may recall, was Marie de Guise, whom we've also met. She was a widow of King James V of Scotland. And at the time that all this happened, in 1559, when King Henri II died, she was fighting to preserve Scotland as a Catholic realm for her young daughter. The new French king, Francois II, was sickly, and his Italian mother, Catherine de' Medici, was never entirely trusted by the French aristocracy. Even though they would not repudiate her entirely, because she was a conduit for gold from Italian banks. Now, Catherine's family had played this game for 200 years, so she knew how to navigate this. Skillfully employing, shall we say, metallic persuasion, she drew to her son's cause her daughter-in-law's uncles of the House of de Guise, which was a cadet branch of the House of Lorraine, at the time, the Duchy of Lorraine, no, actually, let me. Okay. All right, now this is a problem because I'm not going to be able to see. Okay. All right. So, right here. I don't know if you can see it, but this is Lorraine. And say so. There's France and Lorraine. Lorraine is up here. Now now Lorraine is of course part of France, but at the time it was not. It was it was analogous to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg today. It was not a kingdom, but it was an independent duchy. So that even though there was a duke, not a king, he was a sovereign. So the reigning Duke of Lorraine was Duke Claude de Guise. Duke Claude was the father of Marie de Guise, as well as Cardinal Charles de Guise, whom I alluded to earlier. And his eldest son is the one who became the next Duke of de Guise, Francis. So Duke Claude died in 1550, so he was followed by his eldest son, who became the Duke de Guise, Francis. And Duke Claude's daughter, we've met, Marie de Guise. She was a widow of King James V, mother of Mary, Queen of Scots. And then the younger son became Cardinal Charles de Guise, Archbishop of Reims. And we met him during the conclave. He got mad because they started without the French. After the death of her husband, King Henri II, the Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici, became regent for her sickly son, Francois II. She invited the de Guise brothers onto the Regency Council to ensure protection for herself and her son. The de Guise brothers readily accepted, since the young Queen Mary, Francois' wife, was their own niece. Because their sister was Marie de Guise, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was Marie de Guise's daughter. As well as Mary was already Queen of Scotland in her own right. I mean, she was still a minor, but I mean, she was queen in her own right because her father, James V, was deceased and he had no sons. Now, of course, all of these people had their own agendas. But on one matter, these people all agreed that France was and must remain a Catholic realm. The Queen Mother, and now Queen Regent, Catherine de Medici, needed support from the de Guise brothers, not only because she was a foreign Italian in the eyes of many of the French nobility, but also because an anti-Catholic rival to fill the power vacuum created by a young, sickly king existed. Even though we think of France as being a Catholic country, and it was a majority Catholic country, but not 100%. So we've seen Spain and Portugal were completely untouched by the Protestant movement. That's not the case with France. Even though the majority of the population remained Catholic, they did have a sizable minority who embraced the international anti-papal, anti-Catholic protest movement. Among the aristocracy, among the French aristocracy, one of the houses that embraced this was the House de Bourbon, or as we'd say in English, the Bourbons, the Bourbon dynasty. Bourbon. Ironically, these people trace their lineage to Saint Louis IX, Louis, King of France. In the year 1272, his sixth son was Robert, Count of Clermont. He married Beatrice de Bourbon. Their son, Louis, became the first Duke de Bourbon, or the first Bourbon Duke, in 1327. And so time passed. One of their descendants was Charles de Bourbon. He entered the service of King Francis I in the same time frame as Duke Claude de Guise entered the service of the same king, Francois I. By 1514, Charles de Bourbon, Charles of the House of Bourbon, was elevated from Count to Duke of Vendôme. 3 of his 13 children became rivals of the three de Guise siblings. But the de Bourbons were often, at this period in the 16th century, were often on the Protestant side of the dispute, whereas the de Guise side remained Catholic, whereas the de Bourbons, they did not all remain Catholic. All right, so of the 3, so you have the 3 de Guise, the 2 brothers and the sister. So now the de Bourbons, we have the same thing, 2 brothers and so there's Antoine de Bourbon, Antoine Bourbon. He was the eldest. He became Duke of Vendôme, and through marriage, because of the farcical way that these people handled the sacrament of matrimony, he became King of Navarre through his marriage to the she was princess when they married, but she later became the Queen Jeanne the Third, or Joan the Third. The second was Charles de Bourbon, the younger. He became Archbishop of Rouen when the family sent him into the church. And then there was Louis de Bourbon. He's called the Prince of Condé, Conde. On October 20th, 1548, the eldest, Antoine de Bourbon, married the heiress to the Kingdom of Navarre, Jeanne d'Albret. So Jeanne, Geanne, of the house of, so D apostrophe, Albret, Jeanne d'Albret. And she later became Queen the third Queen Jeanne of Navarre. The Kingdom of Navarre was previously the Kingdom of Pamplona, and way back in the medieval course, you may remember, it was the Kingdom of Vasconia after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. It was a Basque realm, ethnically Basque, Basque, comprised of lands on the north and the so there's Navarre, Kingdom of Navarre. So on the north, at the time, this is a modern map, but at the time it was on the north and the south side of the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France, but on the western end of the mountain chain, so on the Atlantic Ocean side of the mountain chain. Their son, Antoine de Bourbon, and the future Queen, Jeanne, they had a son who became King Henry III of Navarre and King Henri IV of France. So their son became the first Bourbon monarch of France. Now, okay, you may be wondering, well, okay, so how, these people are Protestants, so how did that go? Yeah, this patience. So Jeanne, the queen, was one vector through whom the Protestant movement, the protest movement, the anti-Catholic, anti-papal protest movement, found entrance and support in France. She was a niece of King Francis I of France through his sister Marguerite de Valois. They brought the Italian Renaissance into France. As we covered previously, it was that king, Francis I, who invited Leonardo da Vinci to relocate to France, which he did. And that's, Da Vinci died. He spent the rest of his life there. He died in France. And that's how the Mona Lisa ended up in the Louvre. He had the Mona Lisa with him when he died. A constituent endeavor of the Renaissance movement, as we saw, was the study of ancient languages to recover ancient learning. This project was facilitated by the period we are now in, the mid-16th century, by a guy named Johann Froben, Froben. He was born in Germany. He was a humanist by proclivity and training, studied at the University of Basel in Switzerland. That's Basle. In 1491, he opened a lucrative printing business in the city. It's a university town, so if you're going to print books, that's a good place to do it. Basel is located on the Rhine River, where Switzerland, France, and Germany meet. So there, you see. So as the Rhine River goes down, and so you see France on one side, on the western side, Germany on the eastern side, and then Switzerland on the south. So perfect place, perfect nexus for trade. Froben's publishing house became the center from which emanated 3 generations of humanist books. It was his son, then later his grandson, kept the business going. By humanist books, I mean ancient text. So they would print these texts in book form, original, the Latin, the Greek, and later the Hebrew. Froben established the senior Froben, Johann, established a professional relationship with the Dutch humanist Erasmus as a scholarly consultant for Froben's 1514 Latin editions of the writings of Jerome, Cyprian, Tertullian, Hilary of Poitiers, and Ambrose. Froben then published Erasmus's edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516, from which Martin Luther later translated his German New Testament. Later, Froben also published Martin Luther's own works and many other works of the protest leaders of the protest movement. For example, in 1519, Froben had 600 copies of Luther's works smuggled into France. Meanwhile, Froben expanded into Greek text before his death. The business continued and expanded into Hebrew text under his son Hieronymus, and his his son made it a trilingual. Well, no, I mean the 3 ancient languages, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and then they would also publish works in German, French, Italian. But it's a vector from which people, who would not otherwise be able to, would get copies of these ancient texts. Their books enabled a specific endeavor in the French context that we're talking about, which attempted to recognize the problems, the feudalism problems in the church, and attempted to fix them. This endeavor began just on the eve of the protest movement, of the Protestant movement. All of this, so Froben published Erasmus's Greek New Testament in 1516. That's 1 year before Luther nailed up the 95 Theses. And then 2 years later, Froben prints and smuggles in 600 copies of Luther's works. And that smuggling operation was protected by Jean d'Albret, even though she later became a Calvinist, as we'll see. Anyway, so the effort, the reform effort in France, that initially was trying to be a Catholic reform effort, was led by Bishop Guillaume Brissonnet, Briconnnet. Now, if you look him up, there's no these people had no, the naming. It's the naming problem. So he had the same name as his father. His father was also Guillaume Brissonnet the Elder, who was a late vocation. He spent, made his career as a layman. He became minister of finance. He married. He had children. Then after his wife died, he went into the church, ended up becoming a cardinal and later a bishop of Saint Malo in Brittany. Through his father's influence, the younger Guillaume Brissonnet went into the church. He became a bishop of Lodève in 1489 and abbot of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in 1507. So the feudalism problem, you see, being both a bishop and an abbot in two different places. Like his father, he simultaneously entered royal service. He did well, so he was rewarded with appointment as Bishop of Meaux, Meaux. That's in northwest France, northwest of Paris on the Marne River. In 1516, so he was assigned 1 year before Luther precipitated the protest movement. Part of this first generation of French Renaissance humanists, inspired by King Francis I and his sister Marguerite, and Marguerite and her daughter Jeanne d'Albret were friends with this Guillaume Brissonnet, as he traveled at those levels, and they were all humanists. They all learned the ancient languages, and so they could talk to each other about that. Brissonnet offered patronage to humanists who would move to his diocese of Meaux, to this cathedral city of Meaux, and help him reform the diocese. And the French king's sister, Marguerite, as well as her daughter Jeanne, since they were humanists and they were patrons of humanists, they had the mailing list, so to speak. I mean, they knew plenty of them. So the ones who were recruited, they came together and formed the Circle or the Cenacle of Meaux. Over time, in France, as elsewhere, humanist scholarship bifurcated. This study of the ancient text affected people in two different ways that are predictable. Well, it's not. We can't predict how each person, but that it's predictable that they would have to make a choice. They would come to a fork in the road. There were those, like St. Thomas More, whose study of the Bible and the fathers of the church in the original languages caused them to grow closer to the faith. I mean, to actually deepen their faith. As distinct from those like Luther and Melanchthon and Calvin, whose similar study of the Bible and the church fathers in the original languages turned them against Catholicism and toward the anti-papal protest movement. Brissonnet himself, along with King Francis's sister Marguerite, remained Catholic. They were of the first school. They were not uncritical of the church. They recognized the feudalism problems. But they did not question the fundamental dogmas, the sacraments or any of that. They recognized reform was needed, but reform in practice, not reform in theology. Whereas Marguerite's daughter, Jeanne d'Albret, who married Antoine de Bourbon, and she later became Queen of Navarre, as well as some other members of the Circle of Meaux, did not. They went the other way. They turned the anti-Catholic way. One of those from the Circle of Meaux, who turned away from the church and embraced the protest movement, was a guy we've already met, Guillaume Farrell, Farel. We met him in the section on Jean Calvin. Parasiting off the church, Farrell received his education in Catholic schools, culminating in the University of Paris. There he met Brissonnet. He accepted Brissonnet's invitation to move to Meaux as Reformed preacher in 1519, as well as coordinating invitations of other humanists from different fields. Among those he recruited was one of his former teachers, Jacques Lefebvre, who was a priest, as was Farrell for a time, who, like Brissonet, sought to reform the church without separating from it. Jacques had already met Brissonet, having for a time been in residence in one of Brissonet's earlier assignments as abbot of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. There, 2 years later, he published the five-fold Psalter. So the Psalter is just the book of Psalms, the 150 Psalms. Five-fold, the quintuplex, refers to it was Psalms, the 150 Psalms, but printed in parallel columns, each column being a different language. The Hebrew, the Septuagint Greek, Latin, the Old Latin, Jerome's Latin, and then French. He followed this, Jacques Lefebvre followed this in 1512 with a commentary on St. Paul's letters, which greatly influenced Luther and Melanchthon and Theodore Beza and others of the early Protestants. He was condemned, Jacques was condemned by the Sorbonne as a heretic in 1521. But he recanted him. He never actually left the church, but he was silenced at that point. He was essentially homeless when Farrell, on behalf of Bishop Brissonet, invited him to move to the Diocese of Meaux. And Bishop Brissonet appointed him as Vicar General of the diocese to provide him an income while he continued his scholarly work. In 1523, he published a French version of the New Testament, explaining in the preface that Scripture is the only rule in terms of doctrine, but that justification, meaning salvation of the soul, eternal salvation, is by faith alone. Now that's, of course, is a foundational Lutheran position. In 1528, he completed a French translation of the Pentateuch, which is the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And in 1530, he completed the first French translation of the Bible. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's the first French translation from the original languages done by one pen, by one mind. The Circle of Meaux broke up as the anti-authoritarian impulse of humanism affected its members differently. Some of them began to question elements of Catholic theology and spirituality that remained sacred to others, such as the Mass. The matter was forced when Franciscans in the Diocese of Meaux accused the Bishop Brissonet of being a heretic. And there was a trial and everything. I mean, and accused him and the other members of the circle of being heretics. So the bishop, along with Jacques Lefebvre and with Marguerite, who by this point, she was the sister of the King of France, but by this point she was married to the King of Navarre. They all remained in the church. But Farrell, Calvin, and Marguerite's daughter Jeanne, future queen herself, and others left, and they joined different versions, either Lutheran or Zwingli or Calvinism. For a time, King Francis I, along with his sister Marguerite, had supported humanist efforts, and they did not perceive a threat initially in humanist criticism of church corruption, the feudalism problems. As a result, anti-Catholic protest ideas circulated freely in France for 17 years after Luther's 95 Theses. 14 of those years after Luther was excommunicated. This tolerance abruptly reversed following the affair of the posters, the poster affair, which was organized by William Farrell on the night of October 17th, 1534. Posters with anti-Catholic slogans were put up in Paris, Blois, Rouen, Tours, Orléans, and Amboise. In the last place, Amboise, the king, Francis I, happened to be staying there, and one of those posters was put on the door of his bedroom. And he freaked out because that's a breach of personal security. And that finally prompted him to realize that the protest movement's challenge to church authority directly undermined his own authority. Because as French monarchs were crowned in the Catholic Church during a Catholic ritual by a Catholic prelate. The slogans on the placards were not anti-monarchical, but they were really attacking the real presence in the Eucharist, the Mass. That's something that all the versions of Protestantism attack, the Catholic theology of the Mass. Nevertheless, that's not an element. I mean, Francis was not a person of very deep faith. In many ways, he was a real dirtbag. But in terms of theology, he personally did not question the Church's theology of the Eucharist, nor did he want that questioned. That plus the security breach that somebody got that close to put one of these posters on his bedroom door caused him to he just went ballistic. He offered a reward of 100 gold pieces for information leading to the capture of those involved. So naturally, many names were submitted. How many of those were actually guilty, we'll never know. But the first to be executed for this, as punishment for the affair of the placards, was an illiterate cripple. So he certainly wasn't, a guy who couldn't read or write, so he certainly didn't make any placards. He was incinerated on November 13th, 1534. On the other hand, Farrell and Calvin, who certainly were involved in the affair of the placards, escaped to Switzerland. In the Edict of Fontainebleau, June 1st, 1540, King Francis I defined religious protest as treason, without caring about the distinction between Lutherans, Anabaptists, Zwinglians, or Calvinists. This brings us to the French version of the protest movement, the Huguenots. The term Huguenot, spelled Huguenot, and for the plural just add an S, was said, the word was said to derive from a popular French rendering of a Swiss German word, Eidgenossen, meaning conspirator, because the affair of the placards was, considered a conspiracy. And Switzerland, as we saw previously, by this point, half of it had already become Protestant under the leadership of Zwingli, and that's where Calvin later took refuge. So that's, hence the Swiss word. Now, as occurred in every single other country where the protest movement manifested, religious objections merged with political objectives, triggering a civil war. 800 religious dissidents in 28 villages were killed in what French Protestant historians describe as the Merindol Massacre of 1545. That's Merindol, Merindol. It was the name of one of the villages, but there were 28 involved. And 800 were killed, and then hundreds more of the men were arrested and condemned to row on the galleys as galley slaves. 2 years later, King Francis I died on March 31st, 1547. But attempts to suppress the protest movement in France continued under his son, King Henri II, and Henri's wife, his queen, Catherine de' Medici. For example, which I think we alluded to earlier, but that might have been another class. I forget when. If it is, if I forgive the repetition, it's the Edict of Chateaubriand, June 27th, 1551, curtailed the protesters' right to worship, whichever version they were. Again, at this period, whether they were Lutheran or Calvinist as Zwingli, it didn't matter. If you were not Catholic, then it curtailed your right to worship, assemble, or even discuss religion at work, in the fields, or even over a meal. These measures invariably led to the protest movement becoming a haven for all of those in opposition to royal authority. Even if they did not really have any theological objections, or even if they thought about it, they may not have actually agreed with any of the theological assertions of the protest movement, but what they shared in common was opposition to what was viewed as the autocracy, the authoritarianism of the French monarchy. It is estimated that perhaps 1/3 of the French aristocracy were secret Huguenots, owing to their historic antipathy toward centralization of monarchical power in France, because, of course, that diluted their own power. One of those French aristocrats with Huguenot sympathies was Jeanne d'Albret, daughter of we met her already, Jeanne d'Albret. On October 20th, 1548, she married into the House de Bourbon. She married Antoine de Bourbon. Now, Antoine was born Catholic. Well, all of these people were born Catholic. But as an adult, he had no religious sentiments at all. He may have been an atheist, but today atheists are more declarative. They say, yes, we do not believe in God. I don't think Antoine would have even gone that far. He just didn't care. But his wife did. His wife, Jeanne, proved to be a dedicated Calvinist in terms of theology. When her father was King Henry II of Navarre, not Henry II of France, and her mother was Marguerite, who was the sister of Francis I, King of France. Her father, Henry II of Navarre, died in May of 1555. Then she became Queen of Navarre, Queen Regnant in her own right, making Antoine de Bourbon the king consort. They officially took the Kingdom of Navarre out of communion with the Catholic Church, making Calvinism the state religion, or as they probably would have said then, Congregationalism is the state religion. And they raised their son as a Calvinist. He became King Henry III of Navarre, and as we'll see, King Henri IV of France, the first Bourbon monarch of France. So Navarre, at this period, certainly once Jeanne became the Queen Regnant, served as a haven for French Huguenots and as a conduit for protest writings to be smuggled into France. As events developed, with the essential merging of politics and ecclesiology in the protest movement, this facilitated the French Wars of Religion, officially commencing in 1562, although as we've seen, violence began earlier. These conflicts doomed Scotland to also be removed from communion with the Catholic Church after its own wars of religion. To understand that, we return our attention to the House de Guise. We left Marie de Guise still fighting as regent to preserve the throne of Scotland for her daughter Mary, to keep the nation Catholic, and to keep Scotland free of English domination. Marie de Guise gave birth to Mary, Queen of Scots, on December 8, 1542. Her husband, Marie's husband, King James V of Scotland, died 6 days later. The English-supported Scottish Protestants attempted to place John Hamilton who was the Earl of Arran, Arran, as head of the Regency Council until Queen Mary grew up. The Earl of Arran, being a Protestant, wanted to betroth, and later for the marriage of the child Mary, Queen of Scots, with Prince Edward, the son of Henry VIII, who would later become King Edward VI of England. So the Earl of Arran and the Scottish Protestants wanted a marriage alliance between Scotland and England. If this had happened, then the child of that union would have inherited both England and Scotland. And of course, both would be Protestant. Marie de Guise went to war against Henry VIII to prevent that from happening. And she sent her daughter, who was still an infant, to France for protection. That protection included marrying her to the heir to the French throne, the guy who became King Francis II. They married in 1558, when he was still a prince. The Dauphin, the heir apparent. He became King Francis II, as we've seen, after his father died in that ridiculous jousting accident on July 10th, 1559. Now, one might think, with her own daughter as queen now, that the French would provide more substantial military support for Marie de Guise in Scotland. This was not the case, because the reign of King Francis II, was never secure, owing to a conspiracy contrived by the Protestant-leaning House de Bourbon against the Catholic monarchy on behalf of the Calvinist Huguenots. To understand all of this, we return to the House de Bourbon, the Bourbon house, to the younger brother of Antoine. This was Louis de Bourbon, who is called the Prince of Condé, Conde. He was born in 1530, the fifth son of Charles de Bourbon, the Duke of Vendôme. His older brother we've met, Antoine, married Jeanne, who became the Queen of Navarre. Louis de Bourbon was a professional, he was an aristocrat, so he was a professional aristocratic soldier. He converted to Calvinism. In the course of his fighting, he was part of the French army that invaded Italy more than once. And so on the way back, he stopped in Switzerland and he heard Calvinist sermons, and that proved to be enough to convert him to Calvinism. Louis de Bourbon organized the Amboise conspiracy of 1560. Amboise is a place, spelled Amboise, Amboise, which was an attempt at political and religious revolution in France, 200 years before it eventually happened in 1776. So, in January of 1560, Louis de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, and his Huguenot allies began recruiting among religious protesters in France, as well as anti-monarchical dissidents. The plot was to clandestinely recruit troops to kidnap the young king, Francois II, and murder his Italian mother, Catherine de' Medici, along with her aristocratic allies, her French aristocratic allies, the de Guise brothers, and sister, because Marie was still alive at this point. Alarmingly, from the royal perspective, they found a lot of people willing to help in Orléans, in Tours, and Lyon, as well as among the surviving relatives of those killed in Provence in the massacre at Merindol. The details of the plot came to the attention of the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, and her de Guise allies by accident. A lawyer in Paris named Pierre d'Avenel was approached by the recruiters. which he never understood because he wasn't Protestant, they all ended up getting killed. So there's no, maybe they confused his name, or maybe they just assumed because anyway. But they approached him with details, and he didn't let on. Apparently, he had a good poker face, and then he got enough information, and then he chose loyalty to the king. So he informed the Queen Mother, who's also Queen Regent, Catherine, on February 12th. And she informed her de Guise allies, the Duke Francis de Guise, as well as her brother, the Cardinal, Charles de Guise. The Royalist then quietly moved the king, Francis II, to the Chateau of Amboise in the Loire Valley because it was more defensible. And then they quietly began arresting suspects. Once that started, once the disappearances started, the conspirators realized that they were discovered. So they gambled on a frontal assault on the Chateau of Amboise on March 17, 1560, to try to do the deed, to kidnap the king and basically kill everyone else. But the guards at the chateau remained loyal. And those, the conspirators who were not killed in the assault, those who were captured, were publicly executed in ghoulish, really ghoulish ways. And their remains were displayed around the country to terrorize any others with similar ideas. 1,500 died in the attempted kidnapping, which was an attempted revolution. The executions were followed in reprisal, by anti-Catholic vandalism of churches and Catholic sacred art in 20 cities, bringing inevitable reprisals from the Catholics in those cities, leading to full-scale rioting in 20 cities, urban warfare, full-scale urban warfare in 20 cities. In late October of 1560, Louis de Bourbon, the Prince de Condé, was arrested based on information extracted from tortured prisoners involved in the Amboise attack. According to the charges, he was waiting with troops in Orléans back in March, ready to take over the city upon receiving word of the successful kidnapping of the king. And despite his high rank, he was going to be executed for treason. That did not happen because the following month, on November 16, 1560, the king, Francis II, began complaining of pain in his ears and his head, and then he fainted. He died on December 5, 1560, after a reign of 17 months. Catholics widely believed that he was poisoned. Others theorized that it was meningitis. In either case, he had no children. So the throne passed to his 10-year-old brother, his younger brother, who became King Charles IX. On December 21st, 1560, the Privy Council, the senior council in France, named Catherine de Medici, his mother, the king's mother, as the regent of France. Louis de Bourbon, the Prince de Condé, was still in jail and still awaiting execution. He had already been condemned. But Catherine de Medici, in a move she probably later regretted, freed him, negotiated with him. She did not want to start, this younger son's reign with an execution, and she knew the de Bourbons were very powerful. This guy, Louis, his brother, was married to the Queen of Navarre to the south, and, so Catherine, with her Medici background, she just thought of all this as business, that they would just do a deal. And later, that France would pay for that. I mean, maybe if Louis had been executed, it would not have prevented the civil war that was coming 2 years later, but you never know. Anyway, Marie de Guise died on June 11th, 1560, while still fighting in Scotland, fighting an alliance of English and Scottish Protestants. As she lay dying of congestive heart failure, she took comfort in knowing that her daughter Mary was Queen of France and Scotland. But of course, that ended once Francis II died. 1 month later, on July 19th, 1560, John Knox re-enters our story. That's Knox. We met him already. He was a former Scottish priest, former Catholic priest, who turned Calvinist preacher. On July 19th, 1560, he hosted a national Thanksgiving service in Scotland in the Stolen Church, former Catholic church, St. Giles in Edinburgh, to celebrate the death of Marie de Guise. Indeed, her passing gave the protesters much to celebrate, as events proved that no one had the combination of ability and determination to keep Scotland in communion with the Catholic Church. 13 days later, on August 1st, 1560, the Scottish Parliament met in another stolen Catholic facility. It was a former Augustinian abbey of Holyrood. The rood is the cross, so Holyrood. So that's the Scottish rendering of the cross, the Holy Cross, also in Edinburgh. The Parliament met to craft a religious settlement now that Marie de Guise was dead, and of course that meant a Protestant settlement. And the rightful queen, Marie de Guise's daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, was still in France. So John Knox and 5 other protest ministers, coincidentally all named John, so these are the 6 Johns, composed a national confession of faith called the Scots Confessions. The Scottish Parliament voted and approved this in 1560. So this is considered the beginning. 1560 is the date of the beginning of the Scottish Presbyterian Church, which is Calvinist church, but Presbyterian because of Calvinist theology of the priesthood of all the baptized. So everyone who's baptized is a priest. 1 week later, the Parliament voted on the following religious constitution for the realm. There was an act abolishing papal jurisdiction in Scotland. Of course, all the versions of the protest movement share an antipathy toward the papacy. An act condemning all doctrine and practice contrary to the Reformed faith. The Reformed faith was Calvinist in content. An act outlawing celebration of the Mass in Scotland. John Knox and his reformer allies, preachers, were then deputed by Parliament to organize the Reformed Church of Scotland, which in Scottish parlance was called the Kirk, the Kirk, the Church of Scotland, the Kirk. So they retired to write the details in the Book of Discipline. That's the title of it, the Book of Discipline. 4 months and 4 days later, when King Francis II died on December 5th, 1560, his widow, Mary, was no longer Queen of France, but she was still Queen of Scotland. 41 days later, on January 15th, 1561, the Scottish Parliament met again to consider the text that the 6 Johns had put together into the Book of Discipline. Following Calvinist ecclesiology of the priesthood of all the baptized, rather than the Episcopal ecclesiology of their English allies, the Anglican Church, John Knox's Scottish Presbyterian Kirk was to be congregational in ecclesiology and partially democratic. The sacrament of holy orders, of course, was deleted, meaning no priesthood, no bishops, because that's papist and therefore bad. Yet a hierarchy for the Kirk was created, consisting of pastors and superintendents. That was permitted, because that is not papist and therefore not bad. Congregations were free to elect their own pastors. The national Kirk would be overseen by 12 superintendents, not bishops. No, because bishops are bad. But superintendents. And universal national education was stipulated. And that they actually did eventually do, and that's going to really change things in Scotland over the next few centuries. That's why we'll encounter it as the course and the next course develops. Many important thinkers like David Hume, Adam Smith, were actually Scottish because of the education system they developed. All of this was to be paid for by stealing the patrimony of the Catholic. Excuse me, that's been nationalizing the property of the Catholic Church. The immediate problem was that the Catholic Church property had already been stolen by Scottish aristocrats, the lairds, who were reluctant to surrender what was taken. But anyway, problem for another day. 9 months later, on August 19th, 1561, Mary, Queen of Scots, returned to the land of her birth for the first time since infancy, to pick up the fight interrupted by her mother's death. She proved to have her mother's determination, but absolutely none of her mother's talent. She refused to ratify the Scottish Kirk and tried to keep Scotland Catholic. Ultimately, she failed, as we'll see. And just to anticipate things, so you have it in your notes, her son became James VI of Scotland and James I of England. So in the end, they got their way, just not with the same monarchs. So with the John Arran, the Earl of Arran, and the original lords of the congregation, they had wanted to marry to Edward, the guy who became Edward VI, so that their son would inherit both realms. So it eventually did happen, but it went to James instead, and later. The situation began badly for Mary, Queen of Scots, as she wished to commence her reign with a mass in the chapel of Holyrood Palace. Now, the Protestants naturally protested, and her servants were mauled for breaking the law of 1560. Now, of course, she had never approved those laws, and she was the monarch, so she regarded Scotland as still Catholic, and all those laws of 1560 as illegitimate. John Knox then began using the pulpit in the stolen Church of St. Giles in Edinburgh to undermine Mary's authority in every way possible. And she just never had the kind of loyalty from enough people to really make a difference. And she never had her mother's tactical talent on the battlefield, and she did not have military support from France because of the wars of religion, which is essentially a civil war that's going to take place in France. So, she had a lot going against her. Okay. 1561, back in Rome. The new pope, let's see. Let's see. I got to pause for a minute. I'll be right back. I just remembered something. Sorry about that. And I just remembered something that I didn't want. Okay, so in 1561, the new pope. So all this is happening at the same time. So, when Mary just goes back, that's why it's so hard to cover this time period, because there's so much going on. But in 1561, the new Pope Pius IV summoned his nephew, Charles Borromeo, to Rome, made him a cardinal. This is typical Renaissance nepotism, but in the case of Charles Borromeo, he managed an almost unique achievement. He earned a doctorate in both civil law and canon law from the University of Paris, and turned out to be a saint. One who was a key figure in the Catholic Counter-Reformation, as they say, the Catholic Reform. He was born on October 2nd, 1538, the third of 6 children, born to Gilberto, the Count of Arona, and his mother's name was Margaret, or Margareta. She was a member of the Milan branch of the House de Medici. Carlo was born in the family castle, of Verona on Lake Maggiore, 36 miles from Milan. Let's see. So Milan is up here in northern Italy. So he was born just outside of that. As a younger son, his family chose an ecclesiastical life for him. He was tonsured at the age of 12. He was endowed with a benefice, funded by the Benedictine abbeys of Saints Gratinian and Feline. This funded his education at the University of Pavia. He was afflicted with a speech impediment all of his life, so people often underestimated him. They thought he was stupid. But he was certainly not stupid, and he compensated by thoroughness and reliability. He was the kind of person, if you gave him a task to do, it was going to get done. You didn't have to think about it again. So he earned his doctorates in canon law and civil law on December 6th, 1559. 19 days later, on Christmas Day, his mother's brother, Angelo de' Medici, was elected Pope Pius IV. 37 days later, Uncle Pius appointed Carlo to the College of Cardinals on January 31st, 1560. On February 7th, 1560, Uncle Pius appointed him administrator of the Archdiocese of Milan, and later he became Archbishop. Subsequently, he devoted himself to reformation of his diocese, which had deteriorated owing to the feudalism problem. But we'll cover that now. But I'll just say at this point that Milan was very wealthy, so it had been used just for income. It had been 80 years since any of the archbishops actually lived in the city and exercised their care of souls. But it was huge. It had 800,000 people and 3,000 clergy. So anyway, he would do a lot, including he would pioneer the idea of Sunday school. What became CCD. Started seminaries, but that's after the Council of Trent invented seminaries. So we'll talk about that later. He in the meantime, 1560-61, Pope Pius IV and Borromeo as his new chief advisor set about repairing the damage done during the previous pontificate. And many innocent men, as we saw, had fallen to the Inquisition of Pope Paul IV, men like Cardinal Moroni, who had been wrongfully imprisoned for 4 years. Now, in his case, he was released, but because of the rioting, when the rioters went in to burn down the headquarters of the Inquisition, they just broke open all the gates, so that's how Moroni got freed. Now, this Moroni, Cardinal Giovanni Moroni, referred to him a few times, Morone. He was born into the aristocracy of Milan, proved to be a man of extraordinary dedication and charity. He was moderate, was prudent, and resolute in his service to the church. He never once, at least that nobody recorded, expressed bitterness or anger over languishing in prison for 4 years with no trial, no conviction, after being falsely accused of heresy. And he accepted without question the mission given to him by the new pope of being the papal legate to the Council of Trent. If Charles Borromeo gave Pope Pius IV moral clarity and a reliable administrator, then Moroni supplied determination and diplomatic skill, so together these three guys changed history because they saw that the Council of Trent was brought to a successful conclusion. But some more things have to go wrong, of course, before that happened. Which brings us back to France, to an event called the Colloquy, Colloquy, the Colloquy at Poissy, Poissy, but the SS is pronounced as a Z, Poissy. Met for a month, from September 9th through October 9th, 1561. It was a religious conference to effect national reconciliation between Catholics and Huguenots in France, arranged by Catherine de' Medici, who was Queen Mother and Queen Regent for her son, Charles IX. Pope Pius IV sent, as legate, an Italian cardinal, but one, as we've already seen, who was aligned with French interests because he had 4 benefices in France. This was Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, D''Este. He was officially papal legate, but he was accompanied by the second Master General of the Jesuit order after Ignatius. St. Ignatius died. Then this guy, Diego Lainez, Laynez. He accompanied. So they were both representing the Pope. So at this colloquy of Poissy, 6 French cardinals, 38 bishops and archbishops, along with over 100 other prelates and professors, spent a month debating with Calvinists, led by Theodore Beza of Geneva, who was a successor of John of Calvin in taking over the theocracy in Geneva, as well as other protest leaders, Peter Vermergli of Zurich and Nicholas de Galars, who left a record of all this. After a month of debate, the colloquy broke up as they could not agree on a statement of unity, or on a unified statement with regard to belief in the Eucharist, the Mass. Because at this point, the Catholicism and the protest movement, all the different versions of Protestantism, had just become ontologically different with regard to sacramental ecclesiology. And that's the foundation. I mean, it was just too different by this point. Too much time had passed. Too much had been done. As regent and Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, she just wanted stability for her because her son was young. This is now the second. Francis II died. He was young, and then he died so soon. And now she has an even younger son, so she's a foreigner. She's very aware of that. No one let her forget that she was not French. So she's just trying to work out a deal till her son can grow up. The Protestants, they had 12 ministers and 20 laymen, and Theodore Beza was considered the leader of the group. Initially, they were not, even the Protestants initially, they were not looking for what we would call freedom of religion, meaning that they were not initially they were not looking to remain separate, but just be tolerated. The colloquy at Poissy was initially called to reunify. So the thought was that if they could work out a statement that everyone could agree on, that they would go back to just being the church, and there would be one church. But they couldn't, as I said, because of the disagreement on the sacraments. Now, Catherine, borrowing a page of inspiration from Queen Elizabeth I of England, was hoping to craft statements that were so general that all sides could agree. But by this point, they weren't at that point. That there was too much controversy over the Mass, over the nature of the priesthood, the hierarchy, the sacraments, devotions, the papacy, that both sides wanted clarity, that they weren't just going to agree to some general statement. Yeah, we all believe in God, therefore everything's okay. They all wanted something more specific. So the council debated this for a month. Meanwhile, the King of Navarre and the Prince de Condé petitioned the regent for the young King Charles IX, petitioned Catherine de Medici, for an alternative. They anticipated, even though they did this petition before the colloquy ended, they said that there's no way that you're ever going to find a formula that all sides are going to agree on. So just accept that there are going to be multiple churches in France and grant free exercise of religion to all of those churches, whether they're Lutheran or Calvinist or Zwingli, grant that. So time passed. In July of 1561, the regent, Catherine de Medici, signed what's called the July Edict, which recognized Roman Catholicism as the state religion of France, but forbade all, quote, injuries or injustices, unquote, against citizens of France on the basis of religion. So that's some measure, an early measure of religious toleration. However, it was clear that neither side was going to be happy. So in areas where the Calvinists were ascendant, they were just offended if the Mass was carried out, or the existence of statues. They regarded that as idolatry, so they were going to try to stop it. And conversely, that the Catholics regarded them as heretics. So it was just too. I mean, I hate to say the violence was inevitable, but it by 1561, I don't see how it could have been avoided. Okay, the Council of Trent. The third and final period of the Council of Trent consisted of sessions 17 through 25 in the years 1562 and 1563. So we will pause here. Yeah, this is. I find if the file's too long, then it takes too long to upload. So we'll stop here, and I'll just call this file Pope Pius IV A, and then the next one will be B. So seminarians, you have to watch it in order. Otherwise, this it won't make sense. So we'll stop here. We'll continue with Pius, finish with Pius in the next video, and which will also finish the Council of Trent, because he managed to bring it to a conclusion before his death. And then after the council, but before he died, then Islam is going to re-enter the story, and the famous siege of Malta in 1565. That also happened right before Pius died. So we'll do all of that next time. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.